Welcome to our Remote Learning Produce Food Safety webinar series. My name is Ashley Skinner, and I will be your host for today's webinar. This series is funded by the USDA and is led by our PI, Dr. Michelle Danieluk from the University of Florida Citrus Research and Education Center located in Lake Alfred, Florida. This project is in collaboration with Florida Agricultural Mechanical University with PI Dr. Harriet Paul, located in Tallahassee, Florida. Our overall goal with this community outreach project is to develop innovative and engaging remote learning produce food safety curriculum that is highly accessible to diverse growers, particularly small and beginning farmers, in order to equip them with increased food safety awareness and the skills to adopt proven food safety risk reduction practices. To do so, one of our aims is to deliver instructor-led workshop webinars to diverse audiences across Florida and the US. Today, we have some participants from FAMU. Hello, our FAMU students. And finally, we have Kirby Quam and Chelsea Peebles from Florida Department of Agricultural and Consumer Services, also known as FDACS, and Billy Mitchell from Florida Organic Growers as our featured presenters to teach us about compost and composting. Please take it away, Kirby.
All right, thank you. And hello, everyone, and welcome again. I'm so happy to be here and participating in this webinar and sharing with you a little bit about what is one of my favorite topics, and that's composting. We're going to be talking composting basics, on-farm compost production, and a produce safety perspective on soil amendment use. So as Ashley said, my name is Kirby Quam. I work for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services in the Division of Fruit and Vegetables. And specifically, I work with our produce safety program. So it's our team that conducts the produce safety rule inspections throughout the state of Florida. Chelsea, as Ashley mentioned, is also on our team, and she's our inspection supervisor and is on hand today to answer any of those regulatory questions that you might have or that might come up. And we are also joined by Billy Mitchell, soil amendment savant and produce safety extraordinaire with Florida Organic Growers, to share his experience and organic perspective as well. But jumping right into it, just so we're all on the same page, when I'm talking about composting is the decomposition of organic materials by microorganisms under controlled conditions. So we're taking those inputs that we have to build our compost pile, whether it's manure, vegetable waste, or what have you, and we're curating an environment under which these microorganisms can survive and thrive and really do the hard work of breaking down those organic materials into this really valuable and easy to handle resource for us. You're going to reduce the weight of those inputs and the moisture content. And if we're doing things correctly, also reducing the odor and creating a really valuable soil conditioner or soil amendment that adds organic matter and available nutrients for our plants, improving our soil structure, increasing the moisture retention capacity of our soils, and preventing any soil erosion issues that we might have, all of which support the plant growth and development that we need for our crops, and all the while reducing our fertilizer requirements as inputs, because we're adding those nutrients into the soil available for plants. And as I mentioned, all of this work is being done by this community of beneficial microorganisms, which is a really complex, actually, soil food web. Our soil and our compost is alive and teeming with life that consists of arthropods, which are our bugs, large and small, fungi, bacteria, protozoa, and more, which all make up this community and do their part. And in just 1 teaspoon of well-processed compost or healthy soil, we would find millions of these microorganisms. And I should add the caveat here that I am not a soil scientist. I'm not a microbiologist, nor do you have to be to create compost effectively on the farm for use in whatever way that you are going to use it. These microorganisms, I like to refer to them as our micro livestock, right? Because we have to care for them just like we have to care for animals on the farm, that they're going to need air, food, and water, and have the same needs as our other animals. So we have to care for the soil life. And let's start in the beginning with what to feed them. We have our feedstock, or the inputs that we're going to use to build the compost pile. That's where we're going to start, is accumulating or gathering these materials. We need brown materials, and green materials to make compost. So we need those brown materials are the materials that we have that are high in carbon, such as wood chips, straw, hay, paper. And then we have our green materials, those materials that are high in nitrogen. And these are sort of the quintessential compost ingredients that we think of: vegetable waste, manure, grass clippings, table scraps, yard trimmings. But we want a ratio here. We're shooting for an ideal ratio of 25 or 30 to 1. That's the ratio of carbon to nitrogen that we're looking for. Now, none of these materials are strictly carbon or strictly nitrogen. You see some of the ratios here. And it's going to take some trial and error to get this ratio right. We're going to have some piles go wrong. Certainly I have, where if we have a pile that's higher in carbon, it might take longer to break down. It might never achieve the temperatures that we need it to achieve, or encourage the right mix of microorganisms in the pile. Conversely, if we have a pile that's too high in nitrogen, then it might become anaerobic. They might have a tendency to compact or to be too moist or too hot, and so we might not get the proper breakdown in that way either. But the ratio we're going for is a ratio of 25 or 30 to 1. And I would say, though, that one of the most important things about the feedstock is that you want to choose feedstock or inputs that are available to you, readily available to you, that would otherwise be considered waste. You don't want to go way out of your way to get these materials or gather these materials, but again, shooting for that ideal range. So whether you have to beg, borrow, or steal from your friends or family, the neighboring farm, the business across town, we're going to get these materials both green and brown. And I think I saw a hand. Do we have a question?
Yes. My question is, how does the compost breakdown time vary based on the carbon to nitrogen ratio?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So again, those it's going to vary depending on exactly what those inputs are. But in general, I could say from what I've seen that the piles that are higher in carbon are going to take a longer time to break down. They're not going to get as hot, achieve the temperatures that we need as quickly. And the piles that are higher in nitrogen, they may break down faster, or we may actually end up hitting a wall where they become anaerobic and we actually have to start the process over. So I would invite the other presenters as well, Billy, to jump in and help me here. But that's been my experience.
It looks like we have another question.
Oh, sorry, just to add that was a great answer. And we'll, moving forward, we'll talk a little bit more about the factors that kind of impact that composting time, like temperature, water, and air as well. And so they all kind of build on each other, just like almost like making a sourdough bread. All these ingredients, time, water, come together to impact the time.
Jamesia?
Another question?
Yes, based on the materials that are high in carbon and also in nitrogen, I know they're all good, but is there a preference out of both of the tables?
Yeah, again, I would really stress that whatever is available to you, right? You don't want to go way out of your way to, or spend a lot of time or money gathering these materials. Generally, one of the great benefits of compost is that we're using a waste product or something that would otherwise go to waste on the farm or in somebody else's farm, or again, our friends or family or neighboring businesses, to create something valuable for us. So we don't want to go way out of our way to get these materials. I would say there's I'm sure many composting recipes out there, but just using what you have available to you to get this would be the ideal. And then we're going to take those inputs and we actually need a pretty significant volume of these inputs, because the minimum pile size that we're going to need is 1 cubic meter, about 3.5 to 4 feet high and wide in every direction. And we can, of course, make these piles bigger. We see an example of that on the slide here, a larger pile. Larger piles have some advantages in that they're going to be able to retain their temperatures, achieve those higher temperatures that we need for the process. But again, there are some drawbacks in that these larger piles do have a tendency under pressure to compact those materials at the bottom of the pile. And so that's going to take some proper management in order to get the materials to break down evenly throughout the pile. We want to structure the pile so that we're layering feedstocks, that we have this increased aeration, greater aeration throughout the entire pile. And again, that's part of the pile management and making sure that we get an even breakdown and we have greater microorganism biodiversity. I think I saw another question.
Yeah, so my question is if like a producer doesn't have, like a farmer doesn't have a tractor or large equipment to turn the pile or like rotate it so it can get the aeration, what would they be able to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, and these can be replicated on a smaller scale. I have a slide on that in a little bit where we'll see an example of that, and we'll talk about it. But you can replicate this with a couple of pitchforks and shovels and a few hours of work, depending on your pile size. Another factor that plays in that is your particle size, and we are looking for a particle size that's mulched or chopped. Ideally, if your particles are too big, your inputs are too big, like logs and branches, again, it's going to take too long to break down. It might not break down properly. You might have branches left at the end when you're sifting through your finished compost, and you may not, if all of your particles are that large, may not ever achieve the temperatures that you need. Conversely, if you're using small particles like sawdust or coffee grounds, or things of that size, those are great inputs. But if your entire pile is that size, then we're not going to get enough aeration. Again, it might compact and become anaerobic. Those things also will play a part in the ease of turning later on and turning the pile as well. And it's a great question. The last thing that we need that I'm going to talk about anyway is moisture content. Just like animals need water and we need water, our microorganisms need water to thrive in their environment as well. An ideal moisture content range is 40 to 65%. Now, you might be thinking, I don't have a moisture sensor, so how am I going to judge the percentage in my pile? That's a great question. One sort of way that I've tested this, and it's not scientific exact, or precise, but if you take a handful of that compost, and remember your pile is going to be hot, so maybe take it out with a shovel first, and then grab a handful, a fistful of that compost and give it a good squeeze. If you have water dripping out of your hand or running down to your elbow, then you probably exceeded that 65% range. If it's dry or dusty and your hand falls apart, then it's probably below that 40% range. You want to see it stick together, leave a wet sheen on your hand, and then you're in the ballpark. So a couple of ways to keep it moist. What I always do when I'm building a turn compost pile is I water it while I'm building it, and then I might water it at each turning. Also covering it to make sure that we don't lose moisture through evaporation, but also making sure, in Florida, we're prone to those torrential downpours, making sure that it also doesn't get oversaturated or too wet. And here we've got a picture. Now this won't work in our Florida soils, most of our sandy soils here in Florida, but working with farmers in an arid region or dry region of West Africa, we would actually build compost piles in the ground. Just another idea to show that it's really important to keep the moisture content in our compost pile. And Kristen, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. So we know that there's a lot, well, the produce safety rule has a lot of requirements for water use on the farm and in the packing houses. So are there any water source requirements for composting that you have?
Wow, that is a really great question. Of course, you are introducing risk anytime you're introducing any ingredient into your compost pile, right? So we have that risk when we introduce our inputs, and likewise, very astute to realize that we're introducing risk if we potentially have pathogens in our water. So ideally, we might use water that didn't have any detectable E. coli if we were doing water testing. If you had municipal water or groundwater, that would be a recommendation I would make over using surface water. But through the process of composting, we're going to, and as we're treating the soil, which is what we do with composting, we are going to reduce the level of pathogenic microorganisms. So ideally, we would be reducing those risks that we're introducing with our water as well. That's a great question, and I would definitely recommend, to the extent possible, using water that we know to be free of pathogens. And that brings us to the composting process. And I'm glad you mentioned the produce safety rule. I hadn't mentioned it much to this point, but what the produce safety rule requires for farms that are covered under the produce safety rule is that we follow a scientifically valid controlled process. There are lots of ways to create compost: cold composting, vermicomposting using worms, anaerobic digestion. But what I'm going to talk about today are two processes that are explicitly mentioned in the produce safety rule as examples of this scientifically validated controlled process. And they're thermophilic composting, meaning they use heat as a part of the process. So as those microorganisms are doing their thing, and we have an exchange of gases, the pile is going to heat up. Those two ways first are an aerated static composting pile. So that's where we have a pile that doesn't move. It's a great big pile here. We have the two examples in the top two pictures here on this slide. We have a long windrow of compost or a big pile of compost. And through that, we have running these perforated pipes or tubing where we're going to pump oxygen into that through a blower. And then we have, then again, we're oxygenating our pile. And through that exchange of gases, as those microorganisms break everything down, we want to achieve a minimum of 131 degrees Fahrenheit over 3 days. And if you look really closely at that top right picture, you might see a thermometer stuck into it. And I love that because if you're not putting a thermometer into your compost pile and it's thermophilic processing, then you're likely not following that scientifically valid and controlled process. So that's one of the things that we need to monitor throughout the course of this. Another way of composting, another process that I'm more familiar with is turn composting. And that's the other way listed in the produce safety rule. So here we have in the bottom left picture, a long windrow of a big pile of compost that's being turned by an implement on a tractor. Again, this is large scale, right? We can also be turned, as we saw in the picture earlier, by a front end loader or a bucket on a tractor. But again, this can be replicated, going back to your question from earlier, this can be replicated on a small scale. So in the bottom right picture, we have compost bins that are built, again, to make sure we have that adequate size of 1 cubic meter, but a little bit more manageable on a small scale and can be turned, again, using pitchforks and shovels and putting in that sweat equity. But with this turn composting, we need to, again, achieve that minimum temperature, same as before, 131 degrees Fahrenheit, now over 15 days with a minimum of 5 turnings. And we want to document that, which I'll talk about later. So if we've achieved those temperatures and we've done the whole process, then we have this curing stage, which could take several months, or I should say at least many weeks for this curing, for the compost to be finished or mature. And when it's nearing finished, you'll no longer be able to recognize those inputs that you initially put in. You'll have a healthy community of beneficial microorganisms, and you can kind of give it a smell test, give it a sniff. And if you don't smell any ammonia or any signs that it may have gone anaerobic, that's a good sign. If you do, you may have to go back and retreat it again. It doesn't mean it's a waste. It just means you need to maybe start back over with treating it. And then you can sift it or screen it to make sure you get that particle size that you want to, the right consistency that you want to add in the farm in your beds. And anything that doesn't make it through the screen, you just add it again to the next pile that you're creating. Give it that squeeze test to make sure that it has the proper moisture. And then if you follow this process, so make sure that you have properly treated compost that's reduced the presence of microorganisms to the produce safety standards, then we can use it, the produce safety rule says, in any manner, which is not the only reason to compost, but it is a great reason to compost and to break down, to treat these untreated soil amendments, the manure, the raw inputs that we have, and create this really valuable product, because then we can use it in any manner that we want, whether that's incorporating it into the soil, spreading it over production fields, side dressing it to crops that are already there, or using it at planting stations when we're transplanting or seeding and inoculating the soils with these beneficial microorganisms. I think I saw another question come through.
Yes, that was for me. So I noticed that we understand the use of the compost, but what are some recommendations for the storing compost so that animals do not contaminate fully processed compost? I understand that there's a lot of in the ground areas to go through that process.
Wow, you just set me up on a tee. If you look at the very next slide here, we've got an animal literally in the finished compost pile. It's a really great question. We do have other produce safety considerations, and particularly storing and handling. So knowing, again, I'm gonna go back and then come to your question here in just a second. Knowing that our inputs could potentially have pathogens, as I just mentioned, one of the main primary reasons to treat this compost. If we're using manure, different animals tend to be reservoirs for different potential pathogens. And it's important to know those risks. It's important to understand where your inputs came from. But in every case, we won't know the history of those inputs, right? If it's tree trimmings from an energy company, or if it's table scraps or food waste from another business, friend or family, even from our own households or farms, we won't always know the full history, what chemicals are in that, what potential animals have come into contact with that, as you've mentioned. And in some cases, we ourselves are the animals, our hands, our saliva, we are filthy. And so we could potentially contaminate these inputs. And so that's why we go through the process of treatment and reducing the risk of pathogens. But then, right, we've gone through all these steps, just as you said, to make sure that we have a safe product. And then how do we store it to make sure that it doesn't get contaminated? You know, I think of it basically in two ways. If we have that finished compost, we want to keep everything from getting into it, right? We have this resource we want to keep safe. And so we don't want Brownie the dog here to be able to come in and then contaminate our whole pile. So we want to keep it covered. Remember, I mentioned covering a pile is beneficial to retain the moisture. It's also beneficial to help keep pests out. It's not just our pets, but also birds and other pests like rodents that might want to get in there and get at the inputs and material that we put in, and then they contaminate the whole pile. And so keeping it covered, keeping it safe, keeping it in a compost bin or stored in secured area is great. We also want to prevent, and doing that, we can prevent runoff and from those rain events, prevent any water to seep through that pile and run off into high traffic areas, where then we can become the route of potential contamination, the vector for that, whether it's our clothes or our shoes, the tires of our wheelbarrows or tractors, or buckets, whatever is going to touch the ground in that area could then potentially contact our produce and contaminate our produce. And so we want to make those considerations, not only in how we store it, but also in how we handle the compost. And then also making those same considerations for cleaning and sanitizing any of those tools, any of that equipment that we use to create the compost or to, you know, that we use in transporting the compost. We want to make sure that when we're done, we clean and sanitize those, or else have maybe dedicated tools for this activity on the farm, so that we're not using that tool and potentially contaminating that tool and then turning around and sticking it in the ground in our production area, or having it directly contact any produce crops. So thank you so much for that question. Really teed me up nicely there. Then finally, we have documentation. So if you're creating compost on farm, it's important to keep a compost process log. What have you done? You want to document the time and the date, the temperature, any turnings that you do, any of those processing steps to prove that you've done that scientifically validated process. For the produce safety rule, this is going to be a requirement if you're using on-farm compost. But even if you're not covered by the rule, for me, myself, this is where I have seen compost piles go wrong in my own process. Is I have all this energy and excitement about the compost pile when I first started. I'm excited about how I'm going to use it. I build a great, nice, perfectly sized compost pile. I've gone through all those steps, and then it kind of falls by the wayside. Maybe I don't turn it as often as I'm supposed to. I'm not monitoring the temperature. It may decompose over time, shrink in size over time, but it's not really properly treated compost that's gone through the process. So this is my own personal accountability log, right? And it's also a requirement of the produce safety rule for farms covered by the produce safety rule. And I have a couple of questions coming in.
Yeah, I had a question. It was from a couple of slides before, but is there any way, you said that the process could take a good amount of weeks or even months. Is there any way for a producer to be able to, like, buy microbes or some type of enzyme to help speed up the process?
Oh, interesting. So you can buy mixes that claim to be, you know, sort of this, what's the word I'm looking for, a concentration of beneficial microorganisms. And there are ways that you might be able to speed up delivering those microorganisms into your production areas or beds by making what's called an ag tea, which kind of falls into another category of soil amendment, which we could probably have a whole nother webinar on. But yes, you can sort of speed that process up and inoculate with beneficial microorganisms. But again, you want to make sure to keep in mind those produce safety considerations and make sure that it's properly treated before you do that. For these treatment processes that we're talking about here today, then you are going to need to go through the steps, and it does take some patience and waiting for that finished mature compost. So that's another great question.
We have two more questions.
Oh, okay, let's bring it on.
When documenting, is it best for only one person to fill out the documentation or assign multiple people to fill it out?
That's another great question. And I think for consistency and control, which I would want just one person to make sure to do that. But what's really important is that whoever is doing the activity is the one that documents it there at the time that they're doing it, when they're doing it, so that you make sure not to forget to write it down, because you don't want to miss that opportunity to, you know, prove that you're doing the right thing. And so it's important, I think, for the person who's actually doing the activity, or at least someone who's present there or knows that it's being done, to document that. But then ultimately, it will be reviewed by the farms that are covered by the produce safety rule. It will be reviewed by a supervisor and signed off for another accountability check. That's a great question. Do we have one more?
Yes. So does the manure source actually matter when considering the processing time and the requirements for the compost mixture? I understand we want to make sure that we know who the supplier is and if it's certified, but does it truly determine everything in terms of what type of compost? So
It does not necessarily determine everything. The processing steps and time in terms of following that scientifically validated process and control process, that would remain the same. I think the most important part is just understanding the inputs that you are adding and understanding the risk that you might be introducing, particularly in the event that something goes wrong with your pile. You would know what potentially the pathogens might be, or at least the source of pathogens might be. And it may affect, depending on your inputs, it may very well affect the time that it takes to achieve those temperatures, or to get the right ratio and the right mix and the right process to affect that. But in terms of following that scientifically validated process, those steps and times and turns and temperatures remain the same. And then finally, what I want to say is that if you're purchasing compost, so if you've gone through the research and realized that, wow, this making compost really is a lot of work and time and energy, and I think I'm just going to buy my compost, that's also a very valid decision to make. And you would want to then, in that case, in terms of documentation, make sure that you're getting from your supplier a certificate of conformance that they have followed the standards in the produce safety rule, outlined in the produce safety rule. Oftentimes they'll provide an analysis and be very proud to tell you what nutrients might be in that mix of compost that you're buying from them. But make sure, again, that it shows that they followed a process and eliminated those pathogens. And if you need any templates for these documents, feel free to reach out to us. There are plenty of resources online. Or you could call us at FX or an extension agent. I think we had another question.
Yes. So if the temperature of the compost is not high enough, what would one do?
So what I would do is it could be a number of factors that are making that situation where you're not achieving the right temperatures. Either your pile size is not great enough, or the inputs that you have might be too high in carbon. You might have too much aeration throughout that pile. So there are a number of things you can do, but in making that fix, what you want to do is basically go back to square one and reshape that pile, rebuild that pile, add the ingredients that you might need to add a little bit more nitrogen, or change the structure of the pile, and start the processing over. That's also a good question, and it happens. Certainly happens. I'm now going to turn the floor over to Billy Mitchell for his experience and knowledge and the organic perspective.
Great, thank you, Kirby. We're gonna wrap up the webinar by just talking a little bit about how the National Organic Program and produce safety, they really complement each other in a lot of ways with soil amendments. Similar to produce safety, the National Organic Program, which you might see this acronym here is NOP. There's another acronym, CFR, which is Code of Federal Regulations. That's where you find the legal language around these rules and regulations. Just like in produce safety, the NOP, the National Organic Program, you're using soil amendments in a way that doesn't contribute to contamination of our crops, of our soil, of our water, and then of course, of our human health. And you'll see that there's a lot of overlap. In particular, they mentioned maintaining a temperature system between 131 degrees and 170 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days using an aerated static pile system. That's exactly like the produce safety rule, or maintaining a temperature between 131 degrees and 170 degrees for 15 days using a windrow. And that's, again, very similar language to the produce safety rule. And so if you're trying to follow organic practices, or you're an organic farmer, you'll see a lot of overlap in the way that you're making compost on your farm, both for produce safety and organic. Let me go to the next slide, Kirby. I had mentioned that one of those acronyms is CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, and the Produce Safety Rule has their own CFRs. National Organic Program has their CFR, and this is not a knock on the lawyers, but sometimes the Code of Federal Regulations can be a little confusing. And so with produce safety and with organic, they also have these guidance documents where they provide examples. They do their best to put it more into plain language to help you really better understand the rules and regulations that impact your farm. This is just an example of one of the NOP, National Organic Program guidance documents that lets you know a little bit more about the allowable feedstock materials and gives a little more information about one way to compost. And this time they're talking a little bit more about those aerated static piles. You might notice in the second sentence on the bottom, there's another acronym snuck in there. We see this a lot in food safety and organics. And then the acronym is OSP. OSP stands for your Organic Systems Plan. And for produce safety, we're often writing food safety plans. And the OSP, the Organic System Plan, or your food safety plan, they're a way for you just to kind of write down your processes and a way for you to start creating the documentation you might need if your farm's going to get an audit or an inspection. And it's just really helpful for employee training, or maybe you have a community garden with volunteers. It's a way to make information accessible so that everybody on the farm and then the farming community can be successful. Kirby, we could go to the next slide. So in summary, both with organic practices and produce safety practices, composting takes waste products into a usable and valuable resource on our farm. It's a way to improve our soil health, our plant health, and potentially our human health. And there are these beneficial microorganisms. I think Kirby referred to them as micro livestock. And in the compost that take that organic matter and make it into nutrient material that helps that plant growth. Certainly, anytime we're doing something with our soil, with our plants on the farm, we're following produce safety considerations, in particular, those that contain animal byproducts, which sometimes in the produce safety rule, you might hear them called biological soil amendments of animal origin, but those are the manures, maybe the animal bedding. And because you've put so much work into this, and you might be getting an audit or inspection, you should be keeping records to document all the work that you did, the inputs that went into your soil amendments, and how you're using those soil amendments on your farm. Kirby, do I get to say the thank yous, or do you want to come back on?
I'm happy to say thank yous as well. We do appreciate the opportunity to be here, and if anybody has any other questions, we are here to answer them.
Well, thank you so much, Kirby and Chelsea and Billy, for being here for today's call. Our students had so many questions throughout the presentation, and thank you all for being able to answer those questions as you had them roll in. Students, if you have any other questions for the presenters, feel free to email them, and same to our viewers who are watching this video. Feel free to email our presenters if you have any further questions. Have a great day.